The morning my 40th wedding anniversary turned into the biggest public humiliation of my life. I honestly thought the worst thing I'd be dealing with was making sure the burgers didn't burn before my grandkids showed up. I had no idea that before the sun went down, a woman with a clipboard would try to throw me off property I'd owned for nearly 20 years. And she certainly had no idea that she'd just picked the worst possible neighbor to bully. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 69 years old, and my wife, Linda, likes to joke that I've spent more years fixing other people's problems than my own. She's probably right. After decades in public service, retirement finally gave me something I'd never really had before: quiet mornings, coffee on the back porch, neighbors who waved when they drove by, and a home that felt earned instead of borrowed. We bought this place outside Williamsburg, Virginia, back in 2003, when it was nothing but scattered custom homes, bold oak trees, and a handful of families looking for peace. 5 years later, a developer built an upscale subdivision around us, created an HOA, and everyone assumed we'd automatically become part of it. We never did. Our deed predated every covenant they ever wrote, and our attorney made sure of that when we closed. It had never been an issue because every HOA president before understood the boundaries. Some liked it, some didn't, but they all respected the paperwork. Then came Melissa Grant. She'd been HOA president for exactly 3 weeks, which was apparently just enough time for power to go straight to her head. You know the type. Brand new title, brand new authority, suddenly acting like she's been elected governor instead of volunteer hall monitor. Linda noticed her SUV crawling past the house twice while we were setting up tables in the backyard. "Think she's lost?" she asked with a laugh. I shrugged, probably looking for someone else's mailbox to measure. We laughed because that's what normal neighbors do. Looking back, I wish we'd packed everything up right then. By noon, the backyard looked exactly the way Linda had dreamed about for months. White tablecloths covered every folding table. Pictures from 40 years of marriage were clipped onto strings between the trees. Our son had set up speakers for music. My daughter arranged flowers around the patio, and the smell of smoked ribs drifted through the yard. 23 family members were flying or driving in from 5 different states, people we hadn't had together in years. My oldest grandson had even postponed a college orientation just to be there. Linda kept walking around smiling with that look only someone married 40 years can have, the kind that says every wrinkle came with a memory worth keeping. I remember stopping for just a second to watch her adjusting one of the centerpieces, thinking life had finally slowed down enough for moments like this. Then I heard tires crunching against my gravel driveway. Melissa climbed out carrying a bright red folder tucked under one arm and a clipboard in the other. Before she even said hello, she was already writing something. "Mr. Mon Harper," she called loudly enough for half my family to hear. "You're hosting an unauthorized outdoor event." I blinked. "Good afternoon to you too." She didn't smile. "Community rules require a special event permit for gatherings over 12 guests. The permit fee is $500 and must be paid immediately. Failure to comply may result in escalating fines." I honestly thought she was joking. I even chuckled. "Melissa, we've lived here since before this HOA existed." She looked down at her papers like I hadn't spoken. "The rules apply equally to everyone." "Actually," I replied, keeping my voice calm, "they don't. This property isn't under HOA jurisdiction." She finally looked up, but instead of listening, she gave me that tight little smile people wear when they've already decided you're wrong. "That's an excuse I hear all the time." "It isn't an excuse," I said. "It's recorded with the county." My deed predates her association. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel personal. "People like you always think you're special." That sentence landed harder than I expected, not because it hurt my feelings, because it told me she hadn't come to enforce rules. She'd come looking for a fight. About then, my brother parked across the street. My daughter walked over carrying a tray of drinks, then froze when she saw Melissa blocking the walkway. One by one, more relatives arrived and quietly watched the conversation unfold. Melissa noticed the audience and somehow became even louder. "If you refuse to comply," she announced, "I'll have this gathering shut down." Linda hurried over. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Today is our anniversary. Could we please discuss this another time?" Melissa barely glanced at her. "The calendar doesn't exempt anyone from the rules." Linda's smile disappeared. I'd seen that expression only a handful of times in 40 years. Disappointment mixed with embarrassment. My youngest granddaughter whispered, "Grandma, is everything okay?" Linda forced a smile she didn't feel. Across the driveway, I noticed two cars that had just arrived slowly backing away. My cousin later admitted they thought the police had been called and didn't want to make things worse. Watching them leave without even getting out of their cars hurt far more than Melissa's words. Then she took one more step forward, pointed toward my own front yard, and said the sentence I'll never forget. Maybe people like you don't belong in this neighborhood anymore. Everything around me suddenly became very quiet. The music stopped. The laughter disappeared. Even the wind seemed to disappear for a second. Linda looked down because she didn't want our grandchildren seeing the tears in her eyes. That was the moment I stopped seeing an annoying HOA president and started seeing someone who had mistaken kindness for weakness. I told Melissa, as calmly as I could, "This conversation is over. Please leave my property." She laughed. Actually laughed, tucked the citation under my welcome mat, turned around, and said, "You'll be hearing from me again." She drove away believing she won. She had absolutely no idea what was sitting inside the file cabinet in my study, or who I'd spent most of my professional life becoming. That evening, after helping Linda quietly pack away decorations that no longer felt worth celebrating, I unlocked a drawer I hadn't opened in years, pulled out a weathered leather folder, and realized this wasn't going to end with another argument across my driveway. It was about to become something far bigger than Melissa Grant could ever imagine. I sat in that little room we always called my study, listening to the grandfather clock tick louder than it ever had before, while Linda quietly folded the anniversary decorations we'd spent weeks planning. And somehow that hurt more than Melissa's insults ever could, because decorations can be packed away. But watching the woman you've loved for 40 years try to hide tears from her grandchildren is something you never really forget. She finally looked at me and asked, "Danny, are we just going to let this go?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the old leather portfolio I'd carried through more chapters of my life than anyone in the neighborhood knew existed. Inside were property records, legal correspondence, photographs, and a certified copy of our original deed from 2003. Tucked behind it was another document that most people wouldn't have recognized, but I remembered every conversation surrounding it because I'd insisted on adding the language before we signed the purchase agreement. The attorney representing the original developer had laughed back then and asked why I wanted such specific wording. I'd simply told him I'd spent enough years watching governments and organizations expand their authority beyond what anyone originally intended. He smiled, added the clause anyway, and that single paragraph would eventually save us years of headaches. I spread the papers across the desk while Linda poured 2 cups of coffee, even though neither of us planned on sleeping much that night. She sat beside me instead of across from me, resting her hand on my arm the way she always had whenever life became complicated. "She doesn't know, does she?" she asked softly. I smiled for the first time all day. "No. And honestly, I hoped nobody here would ever need to. You see, after leaving Washington years earlier, I made a promise to myself that retirement meant retirement. I wasn't interested in introducing myself by titles anymore. I wanted to be the old guy who grilled burgers for neighbors, helped jump dead car batteries, and argued about college football on Saturday afternoons. Most of the community knew I'd worked in government. Very few knew how high that work had actually taken me, and I intended to keep it that way. Fame fades, titles expire, peace is worth protecting. Unfortunately, there are moments when staying quiet only encourages louder people to keep pushing. I picked up my phone and called the one attorney I'd trusted for nearly 20 years, Michael Bennett. He answered on the second ring. "Danny, what's going on?" I walked him through everything. Every word Melissa had said, every witness who'd been there, every family member who'd watched the confrontation unfold. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was silence for several seconds before he finally said, "Please tell me she physically entered the property." She walked halfway across the front yard. Another pause. "And threatened enforcement while standing inside the protected perimeter?" "She did." I could almost hear him rubbing his forehead. "Danny, don't call anyone else until I get there." 45 minutes later, Michael pulled into the driveway carrying a briefcase so stuffed with folders it barely closed. We sat around the kitchen table until almost 1 in the morning reviewing every document connected to the property. The exemption language was crystal clear. Our land was permanently excluded from every future homeowners association covenant unless we voluntarily joined one, something we had never done. Melissa hadn't misunderstood the rule. She had ignored it. There is a big difference. Around midnight, Michael finally leaned back and sighed. "Legally speaking, this is the easiest property case I've seen in years. Then why do you look worried? I asked. He looked directly at me. Because this stopped being a property case the second she confronted someone under permanent federal protective status. I nodded slowly. That was the part I'd hoped never to involve. Not because I feared attention, because I disliked it, but federal law isn't optional simply because someone has an HOA badge hanging around their neck. I made one more phone call that night, this one to an old contact at the Regional Secret Service office. We hadn't spoken in months, yet he recognized my voice immediately. Mr. Harper. Everything all right? Not exactly, I answered. 20 minutes later, I had emailed security footage from our front porch cameras, copies of the citation Melissa left under my welcome mat, photographs showing exactly where she had been standing, and written statements from 3 family members who witnessed the encounter. By sunrise, the process had already begun. The next morning looked completely ordinary until around 8:30, when 2 dark SUVs quietly rolled onto the street. They weren't there for drama. They weren't there to intimidate anyone. They were simply doing what federal law required after receiving a formal report. 2 agents stepped out, greeted me by first name, reviewed the property layout, and took a brief walk around the front entrance. They were professional, relaxed, and almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. Unfortunately for Melissa, she noticed immediately. She drove past exactly as she had the day before, probably expecting another opportunity to flex her authority. Instead, she slowed almost to a stop when she saw the government vehicles parked legally along the curb. One of the agents nodded politely as she rolled by. Her face lost every bit of color. She drove another 50 yards, stopped, backed up slightly as though trying to convince herself she'd imagined what she'd seen, then accelerated away without saying a word. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was the president of the HOA legal committee asking if I'd be willing to attend an informal discussion before things escalated unnecessarily. I almost laughed. Things had already escalated because their president chose ego over common sense. Michael answered for me. My client will communicate through counsel. By lunchtime, Melissa had apparently called an emergency executive session. Several board members began digging through decades of archived HOA records, trying to find anything proving jurisdiction over my property. They found nothing because nothing existed. Instead, they discovered meeting minutes from nearly 15 years earlier, where the original HOA attorney specifically reminded every future board that the Harper residence remained permanently outside association authority. Melissa had never bothered reading them. She assumed confidence was the same thing as competence. Around 3 that afternoon, Michael received a call from the HOA's outside counsel. Unlike Melissa, the attorney actually understood property law. He requested copies of our deed, the county filing numbers, and the exemption language. We sent everything within minutes. Less than an hour later, he called back sounding noticeably less confident than before. Mr. Bennett, I believe your interpretation is correct. Michael simply replied, we know. Then came the question that changed the tone of the entire dispute. Has your client already contacted federal authorities? Michael looked at me before answering. Yes. There was a very long silence. I see. Lawyers understand what long silences usually mean. By early evening, rumors spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Some people thought I'd sued the HOA. Others believed I was selling the property. One neighbor actually knocked on my door carrying a pie because she assumed someone had died after seeing government vehicles outside all day. I invited her in, explained only what I legally could, and watched her eyes widen. Melissa said you refused to follow community standards, she whispered. I smiled. That's one version. What's the other version? She asked. The truthful one. Meanwhile, Melissa apparently spent the entire afternoon calling anyone she thought could rescue her. County officials, former board members, but even the developer who no longer owned a single lot in the subdivision. Every answer she received was exactly the same. If the deed exempted the property, the HOA had no authority. None. Zero. Not yesterday. Not today. Not ever. But by then the paperwork had already moved beyond neighborhood politics. Federal reviewers requested additional documentation. Insurance representatives contacted the HOA regarding potential liability exposure, and Melissa learned an expensive lesson that too many people in small positions of power eventually discover: authority only exists where the law says it exists. Everything else is just noise. I still wasn't interested in revenge. I didn't want headlines, television cameras, or public embarrassment. What I wanted was incredibly simple. I wanted my wife to have the anniversary celebration she deserved. And I wanted one woman to understand that humiliating decent people because you think they can't fight back is never as safe as it feels in the moment. Little did any of us realize, the financial consequences were only beginning. And within days, the very board that had applauded Melissa's confidence would be desperately searching for a way to save itself from the disaster she had created. The first invoice arrived 4 days later, then another one the next morning, then another before the weekend was over. And somewhere along the way, the entire situation stopped being about one arrogant HOA president and became a full-blown crisis for everyone who had voted her into office. Melissa had hired her own attorney before the HOA's insurance carrier even finished reviewing the claim, only to learn that the policy specifically excluded intentional acts that crossed into potential federal violations, meaning every hour her lawyer billed was coming straight out of her own pocket. The association wasn't in much better shape. Their outside counsel had to review years of governing documents, attend emergency board meetings, respond to formal legal notices, and prepare for the possibility that several homeowners might challenge other enforcement actions if Melissa's abuse of authority became public record. Suddenly, the same people who had applauded her taking control were asking why she had ignored the original property files in the first place. The emergency board meeting lasted nearly 5 hours, and according to one board member who later apologized to me privately, it turned ugly within the first 30 minutes. Melissa insisted she had been protecting community standards. Another director asked a simple question that nobody could answer in her favor. Did anyone verify jurisdiction before issuing the citation? Silence. Then another question. Did anyone read the county deed? More silence. Finally, the HOA attorney placed a copy of my recorded exemption on the conference table and quietly said, "Everything that happened after this document was ignored became legally indefensible." That sentence changed the room. Within minutes, the conversation shifted from defending Melissa to limiting damage. They weren't trying to save her anymore. They were trying to save themselves. About a week later, Michael called and asked if Linda and I could meet him for what he described as the shortest settlement conference you'll ever attend. He wasn't exaggerating. Representatives from the HOA arrived looking exhausted. Their attorney carried a stack of prepared documents, and Melissa walked in several minutes late without making eye contact with anyone. She looked nothing like the woman who had stood in my driveway waving a clipboard around. Her confidence had disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable expression of someone realizing that pride can become incredibly expensive. Their attorney spoke first. The HOA would immediately withdraw every citation ever issued against my property. They would formally acknowledge in writing that our land had never been subject to HOA authority. They would reimburse all legal expenses connected to the dispute. They would adopt mandatory legal review procedures before future enforcement actions. Finally, they informed us that Melissa had resigned from the presidency effective immediately and, by unanimous board vote, would be prohibited from serving in any elected HOA position for the next decade. I looked over at Melissa. For the first time since we'd met, she actually seemed willing to listen instead of talk. She cleared her throat and quietly said, "I made assumptions I shouldn't have made." It wasn't much of an apology, but it was more honest than anything she'd said before. I nodded once. "You didn't just make assumptions," I answered calmly. "You humiliated my wife in front of our family because you believed authority meant you didn't have to verify the facts." She lowered her eyes and didn't argue, because there wasn't anything left to argue about. A few days later, the HOA requested one final favor. They wanted the matter addressed publicly at the next community meeting so rumors would stop spreading. I agreed, not because I wanted recognition, but because half the neighborhood deserved to hear the truth instead of gossip. The clubhouse was packed that evening. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other in years suddenly filled every chair, all waiting to hear what had really happened. The board president read a prepared statement acknowledging the HOA had exceeded its legal authority, confirming that my property had always been exempt, and apologizing for the unnecessary conflict. Then Melissa stood behind the podium. Her voice shook at first, but eventually she looked toward Linda and me and said, "I allowed my position to become more important than treating people with respect. I'm sorry for embarrassing both of you and for creating division in this community." The room stayed completely silent until Linda smiled politely and simply said, "We accept your apology. We just hope nobody else has to go through this again." Somehow that quiet response carried more weight than any angry speech ever could have. 3 weekends later, we finally held the anniversary celebration we'd planned from the beginning. The same white tablecloths came back out. The grandchildren ran through the yard laughing. My son stood over the grill, pretending he still knew my secret barbecue recipe better than I did, and Linda spent most of the afternoon smiling instead of worrying. Several neighbors stopped by with homemade desserts, including people who had once believed Melissa's version of events. Nobody mentioned permits. Nobody measured tables. Nobody carried clipboards. As the sun started setting, Linda slipped her hand into mine and whispered, "This feels like the day we were supposed to have." I looked around at our family filling the backyard and realized she was right. In the end, the victory was never about legal fees, federal paperwork, or watching someone lose a title they never should have abused. The real victory was protecting our home, our family, and the simple belief that respect should never depend on who thinks they're in charge. And I'll leave you with this because I'm genuinely curious. If someone in your neighborhood tried to use a little bit of power to control people they clearly had no authority over, would you have handled it the way I did? Or would you have taken a completely different approach? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, I think that's exactly how conversations about fairness, community, and real accountability should begin.